The wind rose cold off the butte, brushing low across the plains like a whisper no one wanted to hear. Snow had fallen the night before, and the earth wore it like morning lace, quiet, soft, and sorrowful. It clung to the high grass and the cracked wooden rails of the fence that stood crooked outside the cabin, and it had not yet melted from the small wooden cross beneath the cottonwood tree. That was where she'd laid her daughter down. Myra knelt there most mornings, fingers raw and pink from the freeze, holding a small length of wool that used to be part of the child's shawl. It didn't keep her warm anymore, not really, but she couldn't bring herself to tuck it away. Each stitch had been made by hand, each row wrapped in the rhythm of lullabies and whispers, now hushed forever by that long winter night. The girl had been 5, small and wide-eyed, with a habit of tucking snowberries into Mara's apron when she wasn't looking. Fever took her fast, the kind that burns too bright before it dies down into stillness. The doctor hadn't come. There been no one to send. The cabin stood 3 days' ride from the nearest settlement, and Mara had chosen it for that reason. After her husband rode west and never returned, she'd wanted the silence. She hadn't known what that silence would cost. The pain didn't ease. It calcified. She moved like someone underwater now, slow, deliberate, the weight of grief pressing against her ribs with each breath. She still chopped wood, still boiled beans, still drew water from the creek, but everything tasted of ash. Even time, especially time. It was near sundown when she saw the rider. A dark shape against the flurrying light, galloping hard, then staggering, then slowing to a limp. The horse was lathered in sweat, legs trembling beneath its coat, and the man atop it slumped like he'd been stitched to the saddle. Mara stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, heart neither quick nor calm, just expectant, like the land itself. You didn't live this far out and expect visitors with good news. The man didn't fall off the horse so much as slide, hitting the ground with a dull thud that puffed snow in a circle around him. He was bleeding, badly, the kind of bleeding that didn't look recent, more like a wound left to fester. His coat was torn, one boot was missing. His eyes fluttered open just once, pale green rimmed in red, and she heard him say something that might have been a name or might have been nothing at all. She should have left him, she knew that. Strangers brought trouble, bleeding strangers brought worse. But she'd buried her child 3 weeks ago, and there was something in the way his hand clawed toward the earth like he was trying to hold on to it that caught at her. Like a prayer or a curse, Myra dragged him inside. The cabin was small, just one room and a loft, but it was warm. She stripped his coat, peeled away the blood-crusted shirt beneath, and saw the wound high on his ribs. Bullet. She didn't ask what side he'd been on. Didn't matter, not out here. She cleaned it with snowmelt and whiskey, sewed it with hands that had once stitched dolls and tears in dresses. He didn't wake, didn't move. Just lay there breathing like someone afraid to start again. For 2 days he burned. She spooned broth into his mouth when he stirred, wiped sweat from his brow, changed the bandages when they bled through. She didn't ask who he was. Didn't ask why he was running. There was time for that maybe if he lived, maybe not. He woke on the 3rd morning. Where am I? His voice was sand and rust, cracked from thirst and pain. Mara poured water slow into a tin cup and held it to his lips. Nowhere, she said, close enough to it. His eyes found her face, lingered there. He didn't smile, she didn't either. You fix me up. No one else here to do it. A silence stretched between them, taut and wary. She sat back on the stool beside the fire, watching him with the same calm she gave to storms. He looked like he wanted to ask something else, but the pain stole his breath before he could. That night, she sat by the fire long after he slept, listening to the wind stroke the shutters, to the wood pop in the hearth. She didn't cry. She hadn't since the burial. The tears had dried up with the thaw, and now there was only this stillness. She didn't yet know that something had shifted, that kindness, even bitter and reluctant, had laid its seed in her again. But the outlaw was breathing in her bed, and her hands smelled like his blood, and for the first time in weeks she didn't dream of death. He didn't give his name, not for days, and Mara didn't ask. There was a rule to such things out here. You treated the wound before you questioned the man. The snow eased, and the wind turned sharper, the kind that carried scent and sound from miles off. Mara kept the shotgun propped by the door and a second one beneath the bed. Not because she feared him. No, he moved like a man broken open, not dangerous, not yet, but because the world was watching. It always was. He healed slow. She caught him limping to the barn one morning, stubborn as a mule, trying to feed the horses though he barely stood upright. "You're gonna split that wound clean open again," she warned, arms crossed, breath frosting in the cold air. He didn't answer, just pressed a hand to his side and kept shuffling. So she took the pail from him and finished the chore herself, neither of them speaking. When they returned inside, he sat near the fire like a dog turned out too long, soaking in the warmth with a look that held something close to shame. That night he finally said, "They were after me, Bounty boys south of Abilene." Mara stirred the stew, slow and even. "You kill someone. Not the ones they think." That was all. She didn't push. The world didn't need more men explaining themselves. It needed more men quiet in the face of their wrongs. Later, he asked, "You always live out here alone?" "Not always." Something about her voice must have told him not to go further. He didn't, but his eyes flicked toward the corner where a child's quilt still hung folded on a cedar chest. He saw the markers, the small boots tucked beneath the bed, the hand-drawn sketches pinned above the hearth, but he said nothing. They learned each other like that, in silences and half-spoken gestures. He never touched her, never tried. When she handed him bread, his fingers brushed hers only by accident. When she passed him clean shirts, he turned his back to dress. Respectful, distant, but not cold. He began chopping wood once his strength returned, though he'd grimace with each swing. She let him. A man needs to work, needs to feel like his body, still good for something. And she'd grown tired of shouldering it all. Some mornings, he'd walk to the edge of the field and stand staring out, hat in hand, as if he were reading the land like scripture. He told her once that he'd grown up in New Mexico, on a stretch of red dirt so wide you could see 2 days ahead. His voice had softened when he said it. She knew then he missed it like a ghost. Spring began to tease the edges of the land, small buds on the dogwood, the sound of water rushing stronger in the creek. One morning, while checking the traps, Mara found a rabbit still warm and twitching. She took it quick, clean, whispered thanks. When she returned, he was on the roof patching a leak she hadn't mentioned. "You feel like earning your keep now?" she asked, one eyebrow lifted. He gave the barest grin. "Thought I'd try." That night they sat on the porch together, cups of coffee in hand, the stars coming on like frost across the black. The air was clean in a way it never was in towns, nothing but wood smoke and the breath of the land. They didn't speak, didn't need to, and still she thought of her daughter, every day. The ache hadn't lessened, but it had shifted like a stone moving in her chest. The pain no longer hollowed her, it sharpened her sense of what mattered. She watched this man, this outlaw who hadn't yet said his name, and wondered what kind of wound had left him wandering into her life. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was something beginning to grow in the space between them. Not from the fire, but from the embers that refused to go out, and that mattered. That maybe was enough for now. The thaw came sudden and wild, the way it does when the land remembers it's alive. Snow turned to mud, creeks surged over their banks, and the cottonwoods burst into green like they'd been holding their breath all winter. The grave under the tree softened, earth sinking just slightly, and Mara knelt there one morning with her fingers pressed into the loam, like she could hold her child again through the dirt. He gave her space, watched from the porch, hat in hand, eyes lowered. She hadn't told him her daughter's name, not yet. But she'd caught him one morning near the grave, his lips moving without sound, and the look on his face had been one of quiet apology. He started sleeping in the barn come April. "I can ride now," he'd said one evening, eyes flicking toward the hills. "Don't want to trouble you longer than needed." "You're not troubling," she replied, scraping beans into a pan. "Barn's still dry if you stay." And he had, though each day stretched like a question. Mara had begun to rebuild routines. She cleared the wild bramble from the fence line, planted hardy seeds in the garden, mended the roof of the chicken coop. He worked beside her without being asked, fixing what was broken, building what wasn't strictly needed. A bench near the creek, a linta for kindling, a new latch on the smokehouse. But he never said where he'd come from. Or where he meant to go. Once, when they sat beneath the open sky eating cornbread and salt pork, she asked, "You ever have family?" He hesitated, Had a brother once, died in a fire. After that, it was just me. She nodded. Mine's gone too, all of M. He didn't offer comfort, didn't reach for her or lay heavy words on the table, just sat a little closer. She was grateful for that. One evening, thunder rolled low in the west, not rain but the rumble of hooves. Mara rose from the porch like smoke, hand reaching for the shotgun even before the dust lifted. He saw it too. His whole body stiffened, jaw tight. "They after you?" she asked quietly. "Don't know," he said, voice graveled, watching the horizon. Two riders came into view, slow but sure. Not bounty boys, too clean, too sure of their path. She and the outlaw, he was still nameless to her, stood side by side as the horses drew near. The lead rider was a woman, lean and sharp-eyed, with a sheriff's star pinned crooked to her coat. Her companion was younger, broad-shouldered, with a nervous hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You Mara Ellis?" the woman asked. "I am. We're lookin' for a man rode out of Jasper a few weeks back. Shot a deputy, took a horse, disappeared west. You seen anyone strange?" Mara didn't flinch. Strangers don't last long out here. The sheriff looked past her to the barn, to the faint curls of smoke from the chimney. The man at Mara's side didn't speak. Finally, the sheriff gave a nod. "You see anything, send word down the trail. Folks are nervous." They rode off before the sun dropped. Mara watched until they were just two more specks swallowed by distance. Inside, the outlaw sat at the table, shoulders hunched. He didn't thank her, didn't apologize, just said, "Wasn't me who shot that deputy. But I did ride through Jasper, stole a horse. Mine died under me from fever." She poured him coffee. "I figured as much. You think I should go. I think it's your choice." He looked up at her then, really looked. His eyes had lost the fever, but not the hunger, not the weariness. "I've run so long, I don't know how to stop." Mara took a long breath. "Then maybe you're due to learn." That night she left the cabin door unlatched. He didn't come inside. Not then, but come morning she found the porch swept, a bundle of kindling stacked neat by the woodpile, and her daughter's shawl, still folded, still sacred, had been mended with a patch of soft linen she didn't recognize. Something was shifting, not fast, not loud, but certain. The land had begun to bloom, so perhaps could they. The days grew longer and the nights carried the scent of wild sage and warming soil. The world turned soft with spring, but the sharpness in Mara did not fade. Grief had not left her, it had only grown quieter, like a coiled animal resting but not asleep. The outlaw, she'd started calling him that in her mind, still without his name, worked the land beside her now like it belonged to him. He never tried to claim it, never asked for anything more than space to breathe and work. But his hands learned the rhythm of her days, when to water the garden, how to weave fencing tight where the traps yielded best. He built her a wind chime from scrap metal and dear bones, hung it above the porch without a word. When the wind caught it, it sang in a low, mournful way, like it remembered the same sorrow she did. One dusk, as they finished fencing the north pasture, he finally said, "My name's Elias." She didn't turn to look at him, just nodded once. "All right." It felt like a kind of offering, and she held it gently. Later that week, Mara rode to the trading post, a long day's ride west along the river trail. Elias offered to go instead, but she shook her head. "I need the ride." "Need the sky." She took her daughter's saddlebag, the one with the stitched sparrow on the side, and packed what few furs and dried herbs she had to trade. The trail was familiar, crows wheeling above, mule deer pausing mid-step, the old cottonwood with its twisted trunk like a question mark halfway there. She didn't think of Elias much that day, not directly, but she felt his absence in the way silence clung to her like a second skin. At the trading post, she saw the sheriff again. "You still living quiet out that way?" the woman asked, watching Mara over a jar of lamp oil. "As quiet as the land allows." The sheriff hesitated, then leaned in. "We heard the man from Jasper might have holed up east of the divide. You see anything strange, anything, send word." Mara nodded, but her voice was still. "The only thing strange is how fast folks believe what they hear." She rode home slow, dusk turning the land copper and violet. The air held that particular chill that warned of rain 2 days off. And when she crested the final rise, she saw smoke rising, thick, black, wrong. The barn was burning. Her horse ran hard toward it, hooves splitting the silence. She leapt off before it stopped, stumbling over the churned earth. Flames bit skyward from the roof, and Elias was there, face smeared with soot, hauling buckets from the creek like a man possessed. She joined him. Neither spoke. The fire had taken half the structure already, but together they managed to save the horses, the tools, the feed. When the worst of it had burned itself out and the stars reappeared through the smoke, they collapsed in the mud beside the smoldering ruin. "Lantern kicked over," Elias said hoarsely. "I was careless." She stared at the glowing embers. "We can rebuild." He looked at her like she'd said something holy. That night, for the first time, he came inside, not to claim warmth or bed or comfort. Just to sit. He took the floor near the hearth, back against the wall, legs outstretched. She brewed him tea with honey, set it in his hands, and sat beside him. The fire snapped and danced. His voice broke the hush. "When I lost my brother, I rode 3 days without stopping. Couldn't even bury him. The river took him. I've been running ever since. Didn't know I was looking for anything till I wound up here." She didn't answer. Just reached for the shawl, held it in her lap, eyes on the flicker of flame. He whispered, "I'm tired, Mara." "I know," she said. "Me too." Outside, the ashes cooled. The land listened, as it always did. And inside the cabin, 2 souls worn thin by sorrow sat breathing the same still air, not speaking of love, but beginning, perhaps, to feel the shape of it. By summer, the garden stood green and proud, beans climbing their trellis like they'd never known hunger. Corn whispered in the wind, stalks thick with promise. The rebuilt barn stood stouter than the last, with walls of hand-split pine and a new crossbeam Elias had carved with a sparrow near the center, same as the one sewn on the old saddlebag. He never spoke of it, but she noticed, and she let it be. The rhythm of their days settled into something like a song, not sweet, not soft, but steady. He'd rise early, start the fire, and leave a tin of coffee warming on the stove. She'd gather eggs, braid her hair back, and move through the morning like it might split open if she rushed. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Their quiet had its own language. One evening in July, a storm came from the west, sudden and brutal, wind like a scream. Lightning cracked the ridgeline, and the cabin trembled with every flash. Mara stood in the doorway, watching the trees bend like penitents. Elias appeared beside her, eyes dark with memory. "Storms like this remind me," he said, voice low, "of how fast the world can turn." She nodded, "I know." They waited it out side by side, neither flinching when thunder shook the walls. After, when the rain softened to a hush, she lit the oil lamp and brought out the old fiddle. "I haven't played since," her voice caught, "since before." Elias didn't speak, just sat cross-legged on the floor, listening as she tuned it slow. Her fingers found the strings like they remembered all on their own, and the first notes came rough, splintered, then smoothed into something near beautiful. She played an old hymn, then a waltz. Then something unnamed, just breath and memory turned to sound. When she finished, the silence that followed was full. He didn't clap, just met her eyes and said, "Thank you." Later that week, the sheriff came again. Rode in alone this time, dust on her coat, sun at her back. "Can I speak with you?" she asked, reins in hand. Mara glanced at Elias, who stood beside the coop, hammer in hand. "Go on," Mara said to him gently. He nodded once and disappeared into the trees. The sheriff dismounted, wiping sweat from her brow. "That man, Elias, he's not the one we're hunting. We found the real killer. Turned himself in down in San Angelo. Guilt broke him, I guess." Mara waited. "I figured you ought to know, and I wanted to say thank you," the sheriff offered a tight smile, "for holding your line." Mara gave a single nod. "A person's more than what the world claims they are." As the sheriff rode off, Mara felt the weight of it lift, not just the fear, but the ache of not knowing, of wondering if she'd been a fool. She turned to find Elias standing in the tree line, watching, not hiding, just waiting. When she reached him, he looked at her like he didn't know what to do with the air between them. "You're free now," she said. "I was never locked up." She stepped closer. "That's not what I meant." He swallowed hard. "You think I should go?" "I think you can stay." His breath left him slow, like he'd been holding it for years. "And if I want to build something here, not just fences and barns, but something real, with you." She didn't answer with words, just reached for his hand, calloused and warm, and placed it over her heart. There, beneath his palm, he felt the slow, steady beat of a woman who had buried a child, survived 1,000 silences, and chosen, again and again, to live. And he knew he was no longer a man running. He was a man arriving. Autumn crept in like a hymn half-remembered, mornings edged with frost, sky gone brass-colored and wide. The leaves turned slowly, one by one, ochre and rust and fire, and the light thinned in a way that made shadows feel longer. The land was quieter now, not empty, just settled like it had finally taken a breath. The cabin no longer held only absence. Laughter sometimes lived there, low and rare as thunder in winter, but true. It came not in bursts, but in those small, stolen moments. When Elias tripped over a chicken too proud to move, or when Mara pulled a pie from the hearth and found his thumbprint pressed into the crust like a child's claim. They had not spoken of love in plain words, but it had grown between them like wheat in fertile ground, tended not with sweetness, but with presence. He saw her grief and didn't flinch from it. She saw his scars and didn't try to close them. In that way, they became something solid. Elias had built a small rocking chair by hand. He left it near the cottonwood tree, where the little cross still stood. Each morning Mara would bring the shawl and drape it across the back and sit beside it in the grass. Not to mourn, to remember. The ache had not left her, it never would, but it had changed shape. Less like a wound, more like a thread woven into her spine, something she carried with grace. One evening, as the first geese passed overhead in their ragged V, Elias handed her a bundle of carved wood. She opened it and found a set of small, painted figurines, a woman, a man, a child with wide eyes and hands held up to the sky. "They're us," he said simply. She looked up and he added, "The what-if version. The version that never had to hurt first." Her throat tightened. "They're beautiful." He gave a half-smile. "I can't give you what you lost, Mara, but I want to build what we still have, if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. Just touched each figure, then took his hand in both of hers and pressed it to her cheek. That night they lit a candle for the girl, said her name aloud. Elias did, too tentative, reverent. He said it like a promise, and Mara knew that though love had come later than she ever dreamed it might, it had come honest. Weathered, true, they married in the fall. No preacher, no paper. Just two people standing beneath a cottonwood with leaves tumbling like blessings around them. She wore the old shawl. He wore a borrowed vest. The wind carried the scent of cedar, and the firelight that night danced bright against the stone hearth. They didn't speak vows. They didn't need to. In winter they kept the lamps burning long into night. She taught him to read slow-moving scripture, and he read aloud, voice halting but steady, as snow fell thick beyond the windows. Sometimes she played the fiddle again. Sometimes he sang under his breath, rough and off-key, but she never stopped him. And every morning, Elias rose before dawn to feed the animals, then sat beside the grave to speak softly to the child he'd never met but somehow carried in his chest. Mara watched from the window, a cup of coffee warming her palms, and for the first time in her long, grief-bitten life, she felt what peace might be. Not forgetting, not healing all the way, but living anyway. And loving not as salvation, but as shelter. She had laid her daughter beneath the frost, and beside a lonely outlaw who no longer wandered, she had found the strength to stay.